welcome everybody. We stick to English at this event today. It is my pleasure to welcome you here, to welcome our main guest, Mr. William Whitaker from Philadelphia, USA, tonight to speak about August Komendant, Louis Kahn, the collaboration, and other things. As you probably all know, this is a two-part event today. At 6 o'clock, upstairs, the doors will open and the Miracles in Concrete exhibition of August Komendant will open. But before we get there, it is time to sit down, as you have done already, and to take a close look to what is absolutely necessarily connected to what you will see upstairs. William Whitaker is a curator and manager of the architectural archives at the University of Pennsylvania in Philadelphia. He's educated as an architect at Penn, but also at the University of New Mexico. He's the co-author with George Marcus of the book Houses of Louis Kahn. I just asked my former colleague, do we have the book in our bookshelf here? Unfortunately, we don't. But another book and project William Whitaker worked closely on is the last major retrospective of architect Louis Kahn's work, The Power of Architecture. And his hand and contribution is quite substantial here, especially in terms of the data and background knowledge in the project. William Whitaker works at the Architectural Archives, which holds the Louis Kahn collection, but also Venturi Scott Brown's collection, Lawrence Halprin's collection, and of course August Komendant's collection. So I don't know any other person who would be able to replace him, connecting those names and to make the connection also to the Estonian context. So please join me welcoming Mr. William Whitaker.
Thank you, Carl. Can you all hear me? I think so. I don't know if I can make all those connections tonight between Venturi, Kahn, Halprin, Commandant, but what I do want to make and help you connect to are some of the objects. How's that? Is that better? Yeah. I like to move when I talk, so it's a big crowd. But anyway, I want to connect you to some of the objects. And so my primary job as a curator, as an archivist, trained as an architect, working in a school of design. So really, I'm there to help teach architects and landscape architects. So for me, giving insight into creative imagination, insight into how great work happens in the world. There's many people involved in that, not just the heroes we single out, but there's many figures that contribute to great work. And when it comes to an exhibition about August Komendant, that naturally opens up that dialogue and expands it beyond just another look at Louis Kahn. And we should keep looking at Louis Kahn, I think, but it's really refreshing and exciting for me to see it not just through Commandant's eyes, but to come here to Estonia, to this institution, to this museum, and to have them do it. And in Commandant's native country, I think that's very, very special. Nobody in America has done what this institution has done in terms of celebrating Commandant and opening up a broader dialogue. Much of what we know about Commandant focuses on a series of collaborations with Louis Kahn, and they're great works. These are transformative works of 20th century architecture. So you open up, I think, almost any book of architecture history, you will find works that have Kommandant's imprint in them. The Kimball Art Museum is one of several that I will touch on tonight. And so it's really critical that, well, we have that as a point of view, right? This collaboration between Kahn and Commandant. But there's much more to it, right? And there were always questions in my imagination and my curiosity about what was Commandant's experience here in Estonia. What were the things that fed into his sensibilities as he sat down with Louis Kahn in 1956 for the first time to start to creatively work together. And for 18 years, they did that. Commandant talks about that in that amazing book, 18 Years with Louis Kahn, now translated into Estonian. So have you guys all gone out and bought it? Come on.
I can do it.
Yeah, you can do it today. What you can't do today, but you should do come late February and early March, there's going to be a catalog that's part of this exhibition. And I'm really very much looking forward to that, to learn more and to know more. Carl Dag Liege, who's the curator here, has done an amazing job. He visited me and my staff in the archives, made great use of the collections. It's inspiring to see our collections used in this way. So I'm very honored to be here on the opening night to make some remarks, to talk to you. It really should, in some ways, be Carl. But his book, the catalog, will do that. The exhibition, as you go upstairs, will do that. The opportunity to see some work that's here in Estonia anew will do that as well. So I'm very grateful for the opportunity to speak today. I'm very grateful for the U.S. Embassy here in Tallinn helped support my coming over. And so what I wanted to do today is really look at some groups of objects and to go through those objects and to share them with you. Right, and this is not, my aim here is not to tell you the whole story of August Komendant or Louis Kahn, but to find within the materials points of connection, points of how they bring their ideas together in really important and interesting ways, right? And then you're going to go up to the exhibit and you can get more information, and we'll also have a bit of time for questions. So. That was my opening slide. That's Commandant. I don't have a clicker, so I have to do it a little differently. And this is celebrating the exhibition upstairs. And one of those behind-the-scenes photos where you see this beehive of activity. And so I just want to take a moment to point out the fact that there are all kinds of people who work on putting exhibitions together, just as there are great works of architecture and landscape. And there's a few of them hard at work making sure that your experience of this work will be satisfying and inspiring. So before going into the talking more closely about the objects themselves that are related to Kahn and Commandant, I want to talk to you a little bit about kind of what I do. And I mentioned the idea of architectural imagination and my collection, the collection I'm responsible for, being part of a school of design, right? So the idea that you bring drawings and models as examples into architectural education, that you bring it literally into the building and that you hang it, as you see here, on the walls of the school. This is something you can learn from. It's probably a natural and very direct way for one architect to learn from another one. Of course, visiting the buildings and landscapes are also quite important. This is the University of Pennsylvania in the 1890s. Here's Penn in about the 1920s when Louis Kahn was a student at the University of Pennsylvania. This is in the library, and you see the drawings here. In fact, this drawing and the one in the middle are still part of the collection that I'm responsible for. So it's really exciting to see, while our collection was founded in 1978 as the Architectural Archives, we have collections that go back maybe more than 100 years. And of course, this follows the tradition of the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris, among others, right? So there's lots to learn by looking closely at drawings. Of course, everybody does things digitally now. And, when I can talk to students, it's always and typically quite exciting for them to see an original drawing, right? The questions of scale, the questions of technique, how you try different techniques as you're trying to solve complicated problems, how you mix up, how you change the way you're drawing to learn new things, to approach the problem in a different way. This can be very inspiring, and we have a great depth of collections, over 400 collections from the 17th century to the present, not just American, not just Philadelphia, but we have great examples from, European architecture, some Asian architecture, but particularly Philadelphia and the United States. But these are examples of the kind of tours we do now. This is in the reading room, and when Carl Dagg was doing research for the Kommandant exhibit, he would work on these tables. Sometimes we give them over for tours, and these are sketchbooks of Lawrence Halprin. He's someone who dedicated himself to keeping notebooks, and I learned from him, so I carry notebooks because of Halprin's example. How you organize your experience of the world around you, how you use this as a tool to think expansively about the work that you do, the factors involved with it. These are all things that I think are really critical to approaching the work of the past today, right? These are learning lessons from what other people have done in the past, not to copy what they did, but to see their ambition, to see how they struggle through a question, how they try different things as they develop a work. And so for me, this is my first set of images, right? And this is a group of photographs of Louis Kahn from 1960. This is him working in his office, right? And what's really fun about them is this is a photographer. He's in the office. This is George Pohl. He knows Kahn. And so Kahn is kind of in his own world, right? And we're getting to see him focused on making some decisions about a house design. It took me about 5 years to figure out that he was working on the Fisher House, one of his house designs. And we see him, just working on his own. At his desk, we see a collection of drawings. There's a lot of different things spread out. He's pausing, he's thinking, he's scratching his head, what next? That gets me really excited when you see an architect or a landscape architect pausing and they're thinking about where to go next, right? So he's going to sit and think, right? He's waiting. He's maybe considering. That gives us pause, though. We can see other figures, other things in the office. We see the objects on the wall. We see the other desks. We see the arrangement of desks. We see the rolls of drawings. We see Marie Quo, one of his collaborators, in the office. Of course, his office had about 12 or 14 people besides Marie. And this is right as he's starting work on the Salk Institute that I'll talk to you in a few moments about, right? So he knows he's got another idea. So you see the charcoal or the pencil to paper, the stepping back and pausing, right? And then in the classroom, right? That these are all places of learning, discovery. These are all places that were useful to Kahn or essential to Kahn in his creative thought. While we're focusing on him just in this little conversation, it's actually much more expansive than that. And to address Kahn and Kommandant as a collaboration is to talk more about this network of people that includes clients, includes the staff that worked for Kahn. And it becomes interesting when you spend 25 years working with a collection, you understand that there are decisions, there are preferences being expressed when Kahn asks or brings certain of his staff to work in a project. Often those staff were his students, right? So an environment here of teaching at the University of Pennsylvania, where Kahn taught from 1955 to 74 when he died. He was a student at Penn in the 1920s, from 20 to 24. This was an important environment where thinking is happening, where discussion about what architecture is about, what the connection between structure and architecture is about. So here is August Komendant. There's Louis Kahn. Above are two other collaborators, the engineer Robert Laricole with the grumpy face and the glasses, and then Norman Rice, the first American to work in Corbusier's office in Paris in 1929, 1930. So talking to the students that were part of Kahn's studio. These are all sources that help inform scholarship, help inform, exhibitions, help inform learning, right? So let's apply some of that. So I have a couple of examples. I'm going to talk about the Richards Medical Research Laboratories and the Salk Institute under this idea of building character, right? I'm going to talk about the Kimball Art Museum as well, okay? And we're going to look at some specific projects. But Richards first, I'm going to emphasize the structural system. But But this is the project that put Louis Kahn on the world stage as an architect. It was commissioned in 1957, and 1956 is the year that Kahn and Kommandant met for the first time and began their fruitful collaborations, right? We can see the completion of Richards in 1961 was followed up by an exhibition at the Museum of Modern Art in New York in 1962, just 6 months after the building was completed. This was a groundbreaking building that signaled a new departure in architecture. Something new was happening, and it was emanating out of Philadelphia, right? It was happening other places, and this is, rethinking modernism, right? This is questioning certain of the canons of modernism or the dogma or the orthodoxy of modernism. You can call it whatever you like, but making it more open to history, more open to individual experience, more open to other systems of thought and value. Ecological systems are very much on our mind today. You see that opening up in Philadelphia, amongst other things. Sorry. And so that's part of the background. Within Kahn's own thinking, though, he was making a journey from an education as a Beaux-Arts trained architect, thinking about the classical world, but recognizing that classical architecture and part of the great Beaux-Arts tradition is a forward-looking modern tradition, a problem-solving tradition, recognizing that there was an evolutionary process going on in architecture that said you didn't have to leave the past behind, but obviously you needed it to be more responsive to the contemporary world. His great teacher, Paul Cray, is part of that evolution. But a key idea is what Kahn talked about of servant served, right? That there are areas of a building where people are gathering to do things, working, living, learning, etc., and that there are places that support that, right? And this is hierarchy. This is, places that support the work of the central character of the building. This is defining character. This is building character, is to think about how in material form, in shape, in dimension, in the details, you assemble those things into an experience that offers the possibility of transformative human experience, not just simple functional solutions that are efficient. And even Kommandant speaks to this idea that it should be bigger. There's something, is the word that Kommandant uses. There's something more to it. There's always a solution that's bigger, right? So this is part of what binds these two men together. But in the plan of Richards, which I'm going to show you more, you could see there's those squares where there's laboratory spaces based on the idea of a studio, right? So the creative studio rather than the loft space, which is very effective for laboratory research. And then there's these small, funny bump outs, which are both structural, but also spaces for mechanical systems. So being able to house mechanical systems like the air conditioning, the heating, the plumbing, and so on, that are a very vital part of a building for science. Kahn wanted to establish a vocabulary for that, establish a place for that, and then to create a meaningful construction out of that. And here is a wonderful early elevation by Kahn that's actually part of the collection at the Museum of Modern Art, which was something that Kahn gave to MoMA in New York at the time of the exhibit in 1962. And you can see these tall vertical towers that contain the services, very monumental, ultimately built of brick. But here you can see these dramatic vertical elements with shadow and brick, shadow and brick. The model upstairs, which we've lent for this exhibit, correlates to this scheme. And you can see how in the corners, there's dramatically cantilevered corners that open up the laboratory to natural light, right? Beautiful idea. It didn't really work to the satisfaction of the scientists, but I really don't have time to go into the full experience of the building tonight. So we have a wonderful set of photographs, and part of what I want to do is just slow us down and have us look at the photographs. I'm going to tell you what we're seeing, but as part of the joy of spending so much time with these materials is to start to understand that you can tell stories and that you can reveal what's on people's minds as you go through. So this is the beginning of the construction using this precast concrete system that is part of the important innovation of August Komendant, right? You can see a large primary structural element that's been fabricated in New Jersey. It's been driven to Philadelphia. Actually, this piece came on a train and then was loaded onto a trailer and then brought onto site. It's a very tight site, very difficult site to approach and to work in. And we can see the crane here. So we can see the presence of the crane and just how tightly constricted that space is, right? But the presence of the crane becomes a really important and inspiring part of this process that becomes an inspiration for Kahn. And we see the lifting of that beginning. This is a favorite photograph, which I've cropped in a little bit, and you just see that 50, 60 ton concrete element. You can see the holes here that are part of the post-tensioning system that Kommandant is really critically important in his legacy. But I want to point out the people that are standing at the periphery, right? I mentioned the exhibition at the Museum of Modern Art. You guys also have to understand that literally people were gathering on the construction site to watch this building being built. So there was this anticipation of something new occurring. And there's evidence of it there. And we know that there were architects that traveled from all over the place to actually see this building under construction. Norman Foster and Richard Rogers among them, right? And they took back to their work the experience of seeing this building being put together. The idea that how a building is made is a critical part of how one experiences the building. And that idea of building character, communicating the purpose of the building through the way the details come together, how the materials come together, this is really important in that regard. I also just want to point out, you know, here are the two men who are lifting these big timbers up, and they're going to place the blocking because they're actually going to put this piece down. Right? We're jumping ahead a little bit. We see them hoisting this first piece into place. It's actually the second piece because when I go backwards, you can see that they dropped that first piece, and then the second piece came up, and then they lifted that one into place, right? So we're reconstructing some of the sequence. You know, it's like a ballet. There's choreography going on. It's not just Kahn and Kommandant. You're starting to involve, you know, Atlantic Prestress Concrete Company, the builders, J.S. Cornell and Company, but then also the collaborating structural engineers, Keystone Hood, were the ones actually on site every day making sure that the work was done with precision. Here's that first piece dropping into place. You have the men holding the guide wires to pull the thing into place. You see some onlookers at the side. You also see there's more people gathered at the top there. This is a drama unfolding. And here they've put the first piece down, right? And if you guys look at that, particularly that tool, that's the tool of someone who's used to working with steel rather than concrete. So if you read the books in the history, Tom Leslie's book about Louis Kahn, Building Art, Building Science is really great. You know, one of the things he notes is J.S. Cornell was used to building steel buildings. They were not yet really familiar with this technology. That's how cutting edge it is. And so you have steel workers trying to figure out how to deal with concrete. And they didn't necessarily have all the proper tools on site when they did this, right? It's interesting. It's interesting to find that narrative within these photos, right? And the guys on the top are just removing the hoisting cables, right? I like this photo very much too. You see the surveyor making sure the levels are correct. And here he's holding the level. Did they put this at the right level? In the end, the building is built to within a 1/16 of an inch tolerance. That's that much, right? So this level of precision is actually really, you know, I think quite remarkable. And here's your first photograph of Kommandant on the site. So he's actually come to the site, and he's part of this first group of assembly, right? This actually took about 5-6 months to assemble the 3 towers. I'll show you in a moment, you get a better sense of it. There's actually 3 different kinds of concrete seen. This one is precast, so it has a very, very fine, smooth precise finish. All the dimensions are very exacting. I'll show you a few deviations in a moment. There's also cast-in-place concrete, rough concrete. You'll see a service tower where the rough board form is different. And then there was walls built within those structures of concrete block, yet a third version of concrete, right? Each different form of material tells you a different thing, right? It relates a different purpose, a different idea. There's actually two cranes on site, right? They're meant to be working in concert, right? So as one is building, they can bring the next, they can be lifting up and preparing the next one, right? And you see that second crane along with the cast-in-place service tower. So there were 3 laboratory towers, precast, post-tensioned, and then the service tower cast in place. You can see the formwork, traditional, extending up, right? So it serves a different functional purpose from the laboratories, and there are different requirements at play. So here we are back to Kommandant, and they're making the first connection between 2 of the precast pieces. The main one's in place. This is part of the tensioning system. They had to put these bolts on, which are connector bolts, and they're lowering in the next piece, right? He's smoking his pipe, so obviously the tension is rising, right? We also see the surveyor is still there. They're pushing it down, making sure it fits. Not quite settled, but you're getting the alignment here. You're getting a sense of how they see the tight constraints of this assembly. But still there's onlookers, right? Those men over there, because they're within the construction area, are probably part of the engineers or part of the contractors that are making sure how all of this goes together. And then finally it's in place. But you can see they've got some wood there to pry things up. I also like this photograph very much. This is Kommandant walking down into the basement area to be able to look up. I like this detail. You see the metal worker, he's really holding that ladder. Is it out of knowledge that Kommandant is a critical part? Do they know who this man is? Right, are they aware of the critical role that he's played in this? It's interesting, I don't know, but this photograph suggests either just, good work ethic on the job site, care about other people on the job site, or a knowledge that this is a special person. And then the view from below of these pieces brought together in 2 different locations. This is a little bit later in the process, and you can see the men are started to be grouped to do the post-tensioning. We'll see that in a moment. These are the end beams. And you can see that there's lots of little details like that, which are creating little pockets that allow for bolts and the mechanism of assembly, the tensioning systems, to give their space, right? This to allow for some, alignment, some slots for alignment, lifting it into place, beginning to drop it into place. And you can see how these edge beams, which are precast, but there's actually not, there's pre-stressing in these. They're covering the post-tensioned areas so that these areas are where the post-tensioning has happened. We'll see that in a moment. But just bringing that element down into repose. These are some of the vertical elements, and you start to see the technical thoroughness. You've got negative 1/8 of an inch, positive 1/8 of an inch. So they very carefully measured all these, so they know the subtle deviations. They've indicated it on the concrete piece. And so when they're actually installing it, it's allowing the riggers, the people doing the installation, to make little adjustments, right? And you can see the holes there are recessed because you're adding a plate that then the coupling bolt is added to. But on the bottom, you have no, that's not necessary because the rod is running straight through. We can see those vertical. The first floor has been laid and they're doing the second level. And here's the actual post-tensioning work being started. I'm sorry this photo's a little grainy, but I think it's helpful to see. You could see the hydraulic jacks. They're getting ready for this because then there's a second photograph. You see there's a lot of stress there and the men are out of the way, right? So they've put themselves in places of safety. You can see the gauges where they see the pressure being exerted, and that's what's actually introducing the tensioning, and then the engineers would come to verify that that's correct. We see the floor completed before they've cast the floor slab. There's the floor slab cast in place, so you can see it's gotten dark. And so here you see it a little bit later. So you get a good view of the Virendale trusses. So the precast concrete technology that Kommandant was very interested in and was innovative here also provided clear spaces for the mechanical systems, for the ductwork. So it created a realm for the mechanical systems of the building, and it put it in dialogue with the place of science where human experience is happening, right? They have not yet built the towers, but those elements become part of how character is built in this building. This is my favorite photograph of Richards. It's different from the photographs that Carl put upstairs, right? But it's interesting to see someone make a different choice than I would. I like this one because it speaks more to the human experience of the building. And while in reality, in history tells us it was not the most successful place for science, Kahn is aspiring to the community of scientists and how you are making their achievement and elevating the possibility of achievement in the building, the possibility of how people get together and think more expansively about the world. So let me talk just briefly about the crane and the hand before going on to the Salk. So I'll just bring you back to this image and just point out the crane. There's a detail of the crane. You can see this logo there. Here's another one of the buildings featured in the exhibit, a different Philadelphia architect named Bob Geddes, George Qualls, and others. The Police Administration Building, another important prefabricated building. Moving in, you can see it's the same logo, but going to a different photograph, you can make that clear, right? And you can see J.S. Cornell, right? So it's actually literally the same crane at Richards now at this new place, and it's probably the same crew, right? This is built just shortly thereafter. And there's the two in comparison for you. And then the roundhouse, as we call it, with its precast system. Ultimately, that made it on the cover of some of the architectural magazines in the United States, Architectural Forum. Another example of Kommandant collaborating with architects and achieving something quite remarkable. But here is a cold storage warehouse in the Meadowlands of New Jersey. So this was a really big facility. They made use of the precast technology. Again, it's the same crane. So I'm getting at two aspects here before moving on. Here's the Atlantic pre-stressed concrete. Okay, I'll keep going. So that this is the team at Atlantic Prestress. So this is Kommandant had his own pre-stressed concrete factory in Lakeland, New Jersey for some years. It was not ultimately successful, but he had a lot of collaborations with Atlantic Prestressed. So obviously there are other figures that are part of the success of Richards, and these are some of them. Here's Kommandant. But I want to come back to these guys. This is yet another building by Mitchell Jurgala. This is a parking garage in Philadelphia. It's not the same crane. I was excited that it was, but it's not. I'm also interested in this photograph where you see, the grip of the tool. And you see an understanding of the physical aspect of building a building and the knowledge of the hand in making a great work of architecture. So on the one hand, you have the crane as this element that creates new possibilities of architecture and design. On the other, there's still this acknowledgement that the hand is something that's important. And this is part of, I would assert this is part of what makes these buildings great. And so I wonder if I looked for this guy on some of the other photographs, but I didn't have enough time to find him. Okay. All right, I'm going to try and finish in 20 minutes. So let me make a point of departure here. We've talked about Kahn and Kommandant for a bit. Let me talk about light and a different aspect of character. And this is Rouen Cathedral and a series of paintings of Monet from the 1890s. And just how the artist is drawn to this building at different times of the day and how responsive the building is in different light and different light character. It's really a beautiful series of paintings. And we see the day moving towards its end. And maybe this is the light at the end of the day, right? This is actually a group of paintings done over a decade. So I don't mean to suggest that this is something that was made in a short period of time, but it recognizes this quality of architecture revealing the quality of light, right? And the surface character or the surface detail of architecture and how light is responsive to that and how architects think anew about that. So Kahn and Kommandant working together on the Salk, particularly the surface of the concrete and the character of that concrete, becomes the next part of the story you want to look at. We can also see this in Kahn's own drawing. So, here is a photograph from January of 1951 in Corinth in Greece. And this is the Temple of Apollo in Greece. And some years ago, I figured out that that's Louis Kahn in his Burberry trench coat, right? And it's a photograph taken by one of Kahn's landscape architects, George Patton. So again, we're talking about Kommandant, we're talking about collaboration. George Patton is extending this conversation out in other dimensions. So Patton was a fellow at the American Academy in Rome, where Kahn was architect in residence. Kahn was leading the fellows on a tour of the ancient world. And in writing about the pyramids, Kahn is not talking about their great weight, their mass. He's talking about the way light hits the pyramids and how through the course of the day, in fact, he's writing home saying, I'm going to go spend the whole day on the Giza Plateau watching the changing light quality in the pyramids. If you're thinking about modern architecture and the glass and steel skyscraper, and then being in Egypt, seeing that mass, that quality on the surface, it tells us something special about Kahn's experience. Well, there are some pastels that Kahn made of his experience there, and he spent the whole day. And these are very simple. I mean, they're just beautiful drawings where there's no figures here. He's just drawing the architecture very directly. Another George Patton photograph towards the end of the day, and Kahn's drawing of that, okay? So we're going to bring this into architecture, into Kahn's work with Kommandant at the Salk. And this, of course, is a building that was commissioned by Jonas Salk. It was a place of research. It is an incredibly successful place of scientific research and inquiry. The scientists who work there recognize that this building gives them something that helps them do their work. And what they get from the building is different and better and more powerful and profound than any other experience they had in a laboratory space. What makes that happen is something that I think we should all be interested in. This courtyard at the center of the building, it's as if the two buildings split and you have just this open space that really has no functional purpose, but it is, in a sense, I think, suggestive of touching and reaching and trying to achieve the sacred. And the way that the world moves around this space and light comes into this space, I think is quite interesting, right? But we're seeing it from one vantage point here. This end of the courtyard. Of course, there's a lot of detail. So the way the pattern of the concrete surface is done, I think, was interesting. But there were two schemes for this. And upstairs, you'll see there was an early proposal that actually went quite a ways into construction drawings designed by Kahn and Kommandant that were 4 buildings of laboratories, 2 courtyards. At some point, Jonas Salk said, I don't like that idea because then one courtyard will fight against the other courtyard, right? There'll be factions. You know, if Jonas Salk is over here, well, I want to be over there. And if you're over there, you're a loser, right? Just to put it very simply, right? But here you also see that there's a garden courtyard. So there were spaces for the scientists to step away from the laboratory to think and to explore, and I'll talk about that in a moment, related to a garden space. So here's Kommandant's proposal. You can see there's this folded beam that spanned the long way across the laboratory that provided a space that you could put mechanical systems, although it might be very difficult to modify those mechanical systems. But clearly the structural system was very present in the experience of the building, right? But when Jonas Salk gave up on the 4-building 2 courtyard, they had to make an adjustment. And so it became a smooth slab. So you really don't experience the full power of the structure. The structure does not shape the character of light. We'll see that in the Kimball Art Museum. But here's one of Kommandant's drawings. The original is on view upstairs of the Virendeel Truss. So you can, again, see that open network, essentially square, that allows you a lot of flexibility to have the environmental engineers, so the heating, air conditioning engineers, have their space to do their work and integrate their work into the overall project. But this is not something you see. This pulls it in a little bit closer. And I'm about to show you a couple of drawings by Louis Kahn, and we'll talk about those for a moment. And we'll look at Kahn's way of drawing very carefully in a moment. But it gave me pause to reflect on Kommandant's way of drawing. And just look at the drawing. It's really fascinating. If you're an architect, and I'm trained as an architect, you know, I'm fascinated by, he knows where every piece of reinforcing is supposed to go. I mean, obviously, an engineer is supposed to do that. But using a soft pencil, the way that things are assembled so clearly and precisely, you know, I feel there's a certain human presence there. And we'll see that in Kahn's drawings. So we're, you know, stepping back for a second, we're talking about building character, and we talked about structure's place in that and the material surface's place in that. Let's talk a little bit, though. This is some of Kahn's first drawings for the Salk Institute. And it begins as a site plan. You can see in the middle a clustering of different spaces. I'm going to walk us around the drawing in a moment. But I want to point out first, it's actually, there's 2 drawings, and you can see this is here is a type of reproduction. It's a diazotype print, a blueprint. I don't know what you call it here in Estonia, but it's something that you make a reproduction of. But there is original drawing on that too. So when I talk about following a thinking process, when you have 2 drawings that are so closely related with lots of different drawings around it, there's a possibility of reconstructing what was being thought in a moment, right? So they're starting with a site plan and they're asking themselves, and I'm using a plural, and I'll get to that in a moment. There are more than one person involved in making this drawing. The different pieces and parts and how it comes together on a site. That's the laboratory space. The circular elements, that's kind of a conference center or a meeting house. And then there was housing, okay? So you're asking questions about how to make a site plan, how to bring a site together. That's on the blueprint. This is on the original drawing, just to give you a sense of the different material qualities. But we're going to go to that corner over there. Now, actually, you see here, labs, you see a figure standing at a table. This is a man or a person doing scientific research. At that side, you see it's a laboratory space, somebody doing work. So part of the conversation of making a site plan is individual experience, and somebody doing their primary work as a scientific researcher, right? So then coming over to this side of the drawing, it took me, it takes time to read this level of detail into a drawing. Here, who recognizes what that is? X and Y, 23. Chromosomes, exactly, right? So Kahn is sitting with somebody who knows something about chromosomes, right? Sounds like there's a scientist nearby, right? But again, we're talking about making a site plan, right? We also, I think, are seeing Kahn's interest in science and the idea that this is stuff that matters in architectural thinking, right? He's putting it on a drawing. I think we should assume it matters, right? What's in the top corner, right? It's the division of cells, right? I thought for years it was a hexagon and he was thinking of some unusual planning configuration. It's actually the division of cells. And they had put this on film. They had captured the division of cells on movies for the first time. Kahn writes to colleagues in Philadelphia about watching that, right? So that is shown up on the drawing, right? And that funny, the shape there where it looks like the thing is vibrating, if you've seen a cell divide, there's a moment when it shakes before it splits, right? So, I think that's quite poignant that he's putting that on a paper because the 1950s for Louis Kahn is about shifting architecture from smooth space, kind of universal space, into articulated space. Architecture begins with the making of a room, right? The idea that you split architecture back up into cellular form, obviously you're still thinking as a modern architect, it's poignant that that's there. You come down on the drawing and there's this strange, what looks like an elevation, and I assumed for years this was just a view of the laboratories from the ocean. The Salk Institute is on an oceanside site with quite a steep cliff. This could be a view of buildings. But you can see there's a tower and a pediment, right? And I'm like, that's not anything Kahn did, right? It took a while to recognize that's a church. And then to figure out what that says. You guys have any ideas? What? Northern France? How about Assisi in Italy? Okay. You're close. And there you get it, you're thinking about a site plan, you're thinking about the experience of an individual doing scientific research. You begin to characterize it as the dedication of monastic experience, of removing oneself from the everyday world and finding a place for dedication, for in-depth pursuit of understanding the natural world in this case. Jonas Salk and Louis Kahn spoke about that garden space being a cloistered garden, right, and alluded to this idea. Of course, Kahn himself had visited there, and this is a travel sketch he made of Assisi. There's a photograph of it. That's a little bit more distant view of it. And of course, this is how you approach the monastery. And when you enter the monastery, you actually don't enter that main sacred space of the chapel. You're entering it from below. And when you come into the Salk, actually you enter the building from below. So that beautiful, magnificent courtyard framing the view of the Pacific and the continent behind you is actually not the way you're supposed to arrive at the building. You come in on a diagonal underneath and you emerge from within from the work of your daily existence in the building, right? That's on this site plan quite remarkably. That relationship to Assisi was also confirmed by Jonas Salk's son. When I was in San Diego for an exhibition, we're sitting over lunch and unprompted, he said, well, I recall this story of Louis Kahn coming out to the family's summer house, and Kahn and Dad, this is Jonas Salk, were spending the day working on the early design, and at lunchtime, and he remembered they had tuna salad sandwiches that day. Dad said to him, do you know about the monastery of Assisi, right? And so I think it's Jonas Salk and Louis Kahn sitting at this, doing this drawing together, right? And then we get to the second one, which here and here, you can see there's additional information happening. So we can see a list of required rooms for scientific research. This is very kind of functional and straightforward. Warm rooms, cold rooms, sterile rooms. If you guys have done laboratories, you know well what those requirements are. But here, then there's a new site plan. And you can see there's 2 laboratories there, 2 buildings that have been divided from a cloister with a centralized space with buildings all around. It's become a building that's been opened to the east and west. There's only 2 buildings here. They're going to soon go to 4 buildings, and then after a year or so, they're going to go back to 2 buildings. But we actually see the emergence of that courtyard, right? And we understand that what's behind it is something more than just functional aspect, right? So in returning to Kahn and Kommandant again, of course, structure is more than that, right? And there you see the meeting house, the housing, and the laboratories. Okay, so let's talk about concrete surface. The overt expression of structure, the part that Kommandant had an important role in, is not really visible in daily experience, but it makes the flexibility of the laboratories key, right? I mean, it makes the laboratories very, very flexible. Kommandant, I think, understands concrete at a molecular level. He understands the chemical processes going on. He understands the effect of the different materials, how you draw out color qualities, and how, you add certain aggregates, you make it lighter weight. He understands all those processes, right? That brings a special voice directly into the drafting room with the architect making these decisions, right? Here are 2 drawings by Kahn later in the design as they're beginning to explore the formwork that makes the surface of the concrete, right? And how you articulate the process of the making. In Richards, that's precast concrete assembled on site. At Salk, and it's cast in place monolithic concrete. One drawing which has figures, actually both drawings has figures. This one is color coded. There's a little detail of the building as it was newly completed. These are places for the scientists to do individual, it's essentially an office, but it has a beautiful view of the Pacific. You can see that there are spaces here for gathering, informal gathering, kind of part of the public space of the building, different from that main courtyard. Yellow lines and blue lines, right? Thinking about how you assemble different pieces of plywood to make the formwork. So this is not board formed, this is using plywood. This is new, right? This is technology that was not so well explored at the time, and the Salk becomes an important touchstone for all concrete that follows. Kahn is drawing shadow as blue, sunlight as yellow, right? So these lines, these control lines, are thinking about light and shadow. So not as the technical thing of plywood and joinery, but as human experience of shadow and light, right? And of course, the figure being present in the drawing tells us that he's thinking again of people and the dimension of human experience. There we pull back to a different position looking in that central courtyard. Sorry. Here's that second drawing, exploring different possibility, here as shade and shadow. So not the kind of abstraction of sunlight yellow, shadow blue. This is more of shade and shadow. Again, the figure is still present and thinking about that human experience. He's designing the formwork, but we can see the presence of those infill panels, right? The shape and dimensions of those details, right? So there's a continuity that runs through the building in terms of the surface feature of the concrete, the surface feature of the wood elements, in this case made of teak, right? So this is an integrated, experience where all of these decisions are leading into a more complex, more rich, more holistically rendered whole. And there's a detail. More recently, there was a wonderful restoration led by the Getty Conservation Institute that restored the teak. And then these figures gathered as part of that experience. This is filed with the technical drawings and not with the preliminary sketches of Kahn, right? So it was a drawing that was overlooked for many years. here are those porch spaces that overlook that central courtyard where there was a possibility, again, of different human exchanges. The blackboards being an interesting example of how you introduce a detail into the mix. This is actually an area very low in the building that nobody gets to experience without special permission. It's actually where all the electrical systems are. It's where they tested out possibilities for how to bring the two elements, the formwork, together. And you can see he's got figures and he's drawing out. This is concrete. He's thinking about marble inserts, formwork. He's actually making allusions to block printing, wood block printing, and how that creates a surface effect of making, right? So he wants to reveal and tell the story of how something is made. So this is a technical drawing, and he's bothering to draw the figure and the figure's experience. So he has to conjure that in his imagination before he moves forward. That conjuring of a figure in his imagination is not something August Komendant had to do, mind you, right? And here, the red is the concrete pour, and you can see how that chamfer is allowing the joint of the concrete place to seep out, and that it allows you expressive potential, right? And a detail. This is actually a very famous sketch that's rarely seen. It's down in the basement of the building. It's actually sketched onto the concrete itself. This is Kahn. Commandant's not there. The contractors are, Jonas Salk is. And you can see they're talking about these different things. And it's not just Kahn's handwriting, it's somebody else's, probably the contractor. Contractors, architects don't often use blue pencils like that. And that's one of the early joints. They're actually quite big. Right? These little elements are only about 1/2 inch to 5/8 of an inch up above, but down here it's about 1.5 inches. So this was too big, too crude. They tried it differently. But this is the magic of that effect as sunlight hits it, right? And just how the tie holes and the little joints really animate the surface, and the quality of the concrete contributes to that. The smoothness of the surface, the precision, the depth of character of the color that's within it. Commandant had an important hand in the choice of concrete and its color. Okay, so I'm almost done. I've got about 10 minutes. So I'm using Carl's title from upstairs, The Common Good, right, to talk about the Kimball Art Museum. And this idea that, certain buildings can elevate the conventional sense of structure, construction, detail, shape to something that is bigger than normal building. And the Kimball is certainly an example of that. And it's probably Kahn and Commandant's greatest collaboration. Structure is the giver of light, as Kahn said, and this building has a beautiful light within, and it makes the experience of art inside more transformative than I think most any other art museum I've been able to experience, right? And I've been to a lot of museums. Of course, the building also has a wonderful landscape. That landscape contributes to the overall experience of seeing the art. And so I just would note that, but we're talking primarily about the sense of structure. So for those of you who don't know, this is a building that's commissioned in the mid-1960s. It's finished in 1972. It's kind of a second phase of collaboration between Kahn and Commandant after the Salk. We can see a sense of the landscape and how you approach. Has these beautiful porches that then give way to galleries within, right? So the building starts with this folded slab system that we see and recalls some of the effort from the Salk project. These long spans, about 100 to 120 feet, depending on the scheme, that would have spanned the full length of the gallery, with these elements that sit within that provide spaces for mechanical systems, lighting, and other technical aspects of the building. But you can see natural light is a presence within the gallery and helps determine the experience of the gallery. You can also see that there's indoor-outdoor spaces within the volume of the building, courtyards essentially, that allow a different light quality to come in. This is a beautiful drawing done on, it's a sepia print that's rendered in pastel. And again, we see that blue shadow, yellow sunlight idea. Here, this is a presentation drawing, though. The combination of garden spaces and structural systems. So Kahn is this figure who is really orchestrating a lot of these different, technical, expertise that's coming in from Commandant and others into this overall powerful effect. The project progresses for budgetary reasons and other reasons into different configurations. Here we see an oval vault being explored. The previous system resulted in a gallery that was too tall for the scale of the art. They were exploring different possibilities. This is around the time that Commandant becomes involved. But here the shape of the vaults are not so satisfactory. It's still a vault, but the shape is rather awkward. But the character of changing sunlight in this group of 3 drawings, this experience within the gallery, perhaps in the springtime, we see the trees are pink and bright green. We see the light is rather soft. Here it's perhaps more in the intensity of the summertime, and that we see the trees are fleshed out, are filled out, and we can see the light is more intense, rendered on the top with the jagged lines of red and pink, right? And that light is somehow being reflected onto the surface of the vault above. So here you can see one of Commandant's technical drawings. This is on view upstairs. And this idea of it being a thin shell, only about 3.5 inches, so about that thick. And then there's a beam at the edge that stiffens the thin shell. It's 100 feet span. And then Kahn has asked and insisted that you remove the material right at the center of the shell where it's at its, the forces are at their highest, and he wants to put light there. So he's really kind of asking the impossible of the structure, but of course Commandant can provide a solution. Here is the building as its construction is progressing. We can see the combination of these porches, which are not really, they're not necessary. They're part of the landscape experience. They're part of shaping, and preparing you for the experience of the art, giving you different shadow places, different places to sit to enjoy the fountains, and then we see the galleries. The porches, of course, are not cut in the middle like the others. Here's a photograph of the construction on the inside where you can see that light slit before a device was inserted within it, and I'll show you that in a moment. And you can see the light entering that space and the formwork, which is part of it. This project really would not have happened if Commandant didn't fully commit to supervising every aspect of its construction, being present as the pours were done to make sure the contractors were technically up to it. So his presence day to day on the site and his understanding of how to operate in that environment is critical to the effect of the building as much as his command of mathematics, his understanding of and design of the structure. But in actuality, as a structure, it functions more as a gull wing, right? So I've taken the drawing and I've cut it apart and I've pieced it together. You can see it's really like a curved beam that spans 100 feet that's connected to its mate on the other side, which it's not a perfect structure, but the overall, given all the different forces related to this project, it is the best solution, right? And then the experience from that point on the inside. I'll draw your attention to the lunettes at the end of the gallery space. Just having the experience of being in Tallinn for the second time, I was here in 2008, walking around the old city, it's pretty delightful when there's an unusual window, right? I think people tend to notice when something is different about a window, that it's shaped in an interesting way. Well, those are shaped in a really interesting way. And I think it speaks to Kahn and Commandant's collaboration. Here is, I think, one of the most important drawings in the exhibition upstairs. When you guys go upstairs, you'll see this. It's a drawing by Kahn. And the blue is the glass of the window. You can see the thin shell. There's the edge beam, which stiffens the edge of the shell. You can see these horizontal elements. That's travertine infill, so that's not doing structural work. And then you can see the mechanical systems. You see how the window is bigger at the bottom, and as it goes to the top, it gets thinner, right? That's a recognition of the reality of the engineering, right? The forces and the requirements are needed most at the top and less at the edges, right? So you could make the window, you had to make the window narrower at the top, fatter at the bottom, or you needed to make the beam narrower at the bottom, fatter at the top, right? An interesting and unusual window. There's a detail of it from the inside as it begins to taper, and the view of it from the outside, right? And you can see some of the other details, the juxtaposition of the concrete and its surface character, which has a wonderful warm reddish color rather than a cool greenish color, against the Roman travertine. This was travertine from Tivoli. And of course, the experience of the art inside, right? So the quality of having the natural daylight inside is really important, right? And the structure is critical to that experience. So I had the experience of working in the Kimball for a week, overseeing the installation of an exhibition in March. And so in March in Fort Worth, Texas, the sun sets around 5 o'clock. So it starts to get dark. So when I was in the museum towards the end of the day, the light levels in the museum really started to come down. It felt like I was, sometimes when you come home at the end of the day and you've entered your house, it's dimmer inside. It gives a different feeling, a different experience, right? So being inside of an art museum and having this almost domestic character introduced towards the end of the day is really something special. And it's only through the presence of natural light that you get that, right? And so the structure helps reveal that. You can see the natural light fixture, which is something that Marshall Myers, the project architect, was really critically involved in designing. Those construction photographs of Richards that I started with, those were all taken by Marshall Myers, right? So there's this kind of small world of people that help give you insight into creative process, right? And there's a detail of the natural light fixture. Of course, you cannot have direct light hit a work of art, particularly a work of art on paper. So you need to have systems that allow you to negotiate the conservation requirements of displaying art against the dynamic changing experience we can have as individuals as we approach a work of art and we experience it. I would suggest you all go to the Kimball Art Museum at some point in your life, and you will have one of the great architecture, landscape, structural experiences that are possible in 20th century architecture. And that's a photograph I took, during those opening days of the connections between inside and outside. So the way in which art reflects our place in the world, reflects our connection to nature. It reflects many things, art. But having that presence of changing light, of landscape, of a garden, a museum needs a garden, really is quite wonderful, and all comes together in this incredible synthesis of art, architecture, structure, and so on. So I just want to end with two things. One is just to show you two objects that I think are actually quite special, and that they're part of the exhibit upstairs. And it was only in preparing these objects to be shipped over that I recognized that there was a story within them. These are August Komendant's school records from the university at Dresden, where he received his training as a structural engineer. Okay? So when they're upstairs, they're properly laid down flat. You don't see the folds so well. So I'm holding them here so you see that, right? What do you think happened to those that would cause that damage? Right? And why would you do that to your university degree? Always carry it with you? Do you do that? But maybe in 1944, when the Soviets are coming and you want to go the other direction and you have to leave quickly, you're going to fold something that's so critical to your future, to your identity, and you're going to keep it right here. So maybe for the next 5 or 6 years, Kommandant kept that close to his chest, right? And these are really not in good condition. So I think he was telling people that, I'm credentialed, I'm important, and he had I think he had a really remarkable experience in those years between leaving Estonia and 1950 when he arrived in the United States, working and observing what had happened during the war years, and to think about how concrete, about how structures, about how a structural engineer could make the world a better place and could kind of put this broken world back together again, right? Kommandant never came back to Estonia, right? These two pieces have, right? So I think for me, that's a special part of being a lender to this exhibition, and part of why I'm really grateful to have this opportunity and the great work that's been done to put on this show. So I just want to end, though, with, I thought about titling my talk not An Engineer's Quest, but, this something is the difference, right? And it comes from a quote of Kommandant, and I'll just read it to you in concluding. Nobody can argue the simple truth that however well a certain structural system performs its carrying functions, the facts are overwhelming that some other alternate structural solution adds to the design something that raises its quality. This something is the difference between a unified architectural structural design and a structural design consisting only of stress analysis and dimensioning the carrying elements. In a unified design, the structure is an integral part of the architecture. It is the architecture. Thank you. So I've been good. We've got a little time for questions.
I'm really glad that you ended with this particular quote, because for me personally, this is the reason I've been interested in engineers, to ask what is the value and where do they see the value in terms of creativity and the artistic part of our built environment. Many say that most of engineers are only interested in technology, numbers, sciences, but those who kind of understand the larger setting acknowledge that, even if it's not their own professional expertise, but they understand that we need this side as well. So we come back to the importance of collaboration and teamwork. And this is, as you said, what makes his collaboration with Louis Kahn and other architects relevant. But we have some time for questions. Unfortunately, we don't have a wireless microphone, but you can lift your hand and feel free to ask anything from William Whitaker. So, I didn't tell you that Estonians don't ask questions, right?
Should I ask myself a question?
Yeah, maybe we should do it the other way, that you will ask the audience and they have to answer.
Oh, test time?
Yeah, we're pretty good on.
No, I mean,
on
I'll just say something then about, the opportunity of experience within an exhibition, right? And so part of what I think is very important and satisfying about lending material out into the world, about making sure it's handled safely and getting over here, and that, people do a great job in installing it, is it gives you the experience to stand in front of the real stuff, right? And I've given some insight into how I see some of the material, but I learn a lot of stuff in the tours I give at school, and it involves students of many different ages. It involves, architects and scholars sometimes, and Carl and I have had lots of great, conversations looking at the materials in my reading room, is sometimes I learn great things and stuff I didn't realize from the kind of conversations that happen in galleries, because there's unique moments that happen in those spaces, right? So it's really quite a special opportunity to have this material here in Estonia. I think it's quite meaningful for a variety of reasons that I talked about. But it's something that you guys can explore. And as an institution that's responsible for holding these collections, I find it very inspiring that this is the way we connect with the future, right? So being part of a school, we're there for the students, and this is the next generation of architects and landscape architects. Hopefully this material is meaningful in some way in shaping their creative imaginations, right? I think when it's in galleries and in museums, such as, the Museum of Estonian Architecture, it's an opportunity to, extend that conversation into a much broader audience about why this stuff that great architects, engineers, and landscape architects, what they're trying to pursue, what it's really all about, and why we should spend money on it, why we should invest in this kind of work that lasts and stands the test of time, right? And what is that work like? Does this kind of exhibition provide us an opportunity to think more critically about the place of architecture and landscape in culture today, right?
Maybe you can describe how the August Komendant collection actually came to you, or was it his last will or something?
Yeah. No, that's a great collection. Great question about collecting. We actually get in visits to the archives a lot of questions about that. The Commandant collection came in two parts to Penn, and I should preface this by saying when Louis Kahn died, he was very much in debt. And it took an extraordinary effort of a group of people to make sure the collection stayed together, and then ultimately it was placed with the University of Pennsylvania. When Kahn's died and his office closed down, everything that was in the office went into storage for safekeeping. Among that was about 120 drawings that August Komendant had made and had lent to Kahn's office for convenience. Anytime they needed to print a set of drawings for constructions or for consultation, Kahn's office had it there conveniently. But Kommandant could not get it until the debt was paid off and the estate was settled, right? So that took 3 years, right? But in that time, it was understood, and everybody understood, you really didn't want to remove those drawings because the architecture and the structural thinking was so integrated, you couldn't understand the buildings without the presence of the structural drawings, right? But this was a very narrow group of structural drawings and also some calculations, right? It wasn't the more creative design development aspect, right? That remained at his house in Upper Montclair, New Jersey, right? There's a photograph of the house and the studio upstairs. So after Kommandant died, there was another group of items that his two children, Yuri and Meriki, donated to the University of Pennsylvania, and that was much larger. And that also included the work beyond Kahn, right? So that was his collaborations with Moshe Safdie, Mitchell Jurgala, and many, many other architects. And so immediately you begin to ask, there's much more to Kommandant's work than just the collaborations with Kahn. And so this really is the first occasion where a comprehensive look at Kommandant's work has occurred, right? So those two collections, of course, join many other collections. We have the Kahn collection, and there's obviously a lot of the dialogue invested there. We've got landscape architects and other people that worked for Kahn, some of the people who collaborated with Kahn. I mentioned Marshall Myers and the photographs. That came from yet another source, right? So we, as an institution, tend to collect in depth, and we collect around certain major figures and think more expansively, including collections that come from clients and other people, model makers and so on. And I think it enriches our understanding of architecture. It's not just one person who's an artist. There's actually many people involved in that. And I think that's a valuable lesson to learn.
So your archive grew around the collection of Louis Kahn, but now, do you have a strategy to get, you have the Venturi Scott Brown collection, and but would you still say that Kahn's collection is the core of the archives, or are you trying to kind of spread it out a little and make more than one, let's say, focus points in that sense?
Right. I would answer by saying we're part of a school of design. So the first thing we're doing is thinking about how we use this in architecture education, right? And so while there is, in a sense, the Kahn collection is an important, center of gravity in the collection, and that continues to add depth to our collections. There's still material out there, and as researchers come in, it introduces us to new ways of seeing what we already have, and that begins to make me think, as someone who's building a collection, about other areas, other people I might talk to, or other collections I might seek out. But I think in many ways, Philadelphia was a center for thinking about the next phase of modernism. So not only do we have Louis Kahn, who's important, but Robert Venturi and Denise Scott Brown. There's other planners that are part of how we're questioning the nature of modernism. The landscape architect and ecological planner Ian McHarg is a great example. Someone who wrote a very influential book called Design with Nature. And if there's anything about what we're confronted with today, we really ought to be designing with nature, right? And it's thinking about the total systems that are involved in our world that support life, not just human life, right? That's something that's coming out of Philadelphia. And, there are times when Louis Kahn, Bob Venturi, Ian McHarg, and others are all on the same jury together in Philadelphia with the students at Penn, right? So I think there's that additional aspect that, when systems of thought are in transition, how is it that a group of people at a school or in a city generate new energy that then flows out into the world and creates new possibilities? I think that is interesting to me as a collector. I know that that's of interest to scholars and to educators who are thinking about, history and theory, and how we do what we do successfully.
Not to think within a box, but between the boxes, or connect the boxes. The last chance to ask a question from William Whitaker at this point.
Over here.
Okay.
The art museum. Yeah, so you're talking about the Kimball Art Museum. It's where the vaults come up and there's the glass in the middle. Yeah. So it's a curved, yeah, so there's the two curved beams, right? So at the middle, there's, where the glass is, there's a few concrete connectors every 10 foot that just keep things in balance, right? They're not structurally doing anything more than just, yeah. Yeah, so it grows up.
So the outside one's to balance the end.
Yeah.
Of the two,
yeah. Yeah, it keeps the structure in balance. Yeah. Yeah, sure.
Anybody else? Okay, I think I'm done. We are done here with the first part of the evening. Just as a practical information, the exhibition doors will open precisely at 6 o'clock. So you will have half an hour to look at our other exhibitions, go see new books in the bookshop, or just have a chat with your friends or colleagues around here. Or
if you want to come ask me questions in person, I'm happy to stand up here and take more questions.
But William Whitaker, thank you so much.